We are very thrilled to welcome you to the 2018 Serpentine Pavilion designed by Frida Escobedo. Please give a very big applause to Frida. We're also very delighted to welcome, together with Frida this afternoon, two of the great experts on Frida's work, Mohsen Mostafavi and Marina Otero Verzier. Mohsen has known Frida longer than anyone else in the architecture world. He's actually one of Frida's main teachers, has also followed the work very, very closely. And of course, Marina is also one of the great scholars on Frida's work. So we're extremely delighted to have you both here. Please give a very warm welcome to Mohsen and Marina. And I just wanted to say a few words of introduction. Tim Berners-Lee was here a couple of days ago, the inventor of the World Wide Web, and he was sort of giving a speech about fighting for net neutrality, saying that we need to make sure that the net, the World Wide Web is for everyone. And he, of course, came with this slogan, "This is for everyone," and that is very true for this pavilion. It's open in many different ways. Free admission. The idea is that it's, of course, with up to 300,000 visitors, one of the most public architecture exhibitions. I think only the Architecture Biennale in certain years has more visitors. And it's very much architecture for all, also bringing actually to the architecture experience people who stumble upon it by chance. Some visitors will come here on purpose to visit the pavilion, but many, many people just discover it on a walk. And so Frida designed a pavilion for us which changes completely with the weather. It's almost like a sundial, and also it's very magnificent in the rain. So in the moment we're in a kind of a limbo zone between the sun and the rain. And we've known Frida for a long time. We met actually for the first time thanks to Joseph Grima, who introduced us at the moment of the Architecture Triennale in Lisbon. And Frida had done this amazing work on the Plaza Civica, which was somehow upon our arrival at nighttime like a moon. It was like an apparition, right? So we drove through Lisbon and had this apparition of a moon. And then when we woke up the next morning and walked through the city, we all of a sudden realized that it was not only a moon at night, but it was actually an amazing platform. It was a civic stage. It was like a seesaw, which could go up and down and could be used by anyone really for speeches. It was almost like something like Speaker's Corner. It already leads here to Hyde Park and to Kensington Garden, and was an amazing public, structure. And this idea really of public works is very much at the core of Frida's work in the social housing, in the Libreria del Fondo Octavio Paz, which is one of the early works, the public library, and of course also in the amazing La Taliera Siqueiros in Cuernavaca, which was also a great inspiration. So we are delighted to, for the first time, bring the work actually of Frida here to the Serpentine. It's the first built structure actually by the youngest architect ever in the scheme in the 18th year. And it's actually only the beginning, because we're going to have many events here. This is actually a ritual. Tarkovsky once said that we need rituals now in our time. And actually, this architecture talk is very much a ritual. We always, the day when the pavilion opens, so you're really among the first visitors to experience this structure, have this conversation with the architects, and very delighted to continue this today. In terms of the content, it was Rem Koolhaas who once said that actually a pavilion without content is somehow meaningless shape. So the pavilion is also a content machine, and that of course leads us to the Park Night. We're very grateful to COS. The COS Park Nights continue this year every Friday with Dorothy Yanon, Miriam Benani, Victoria Sin, Kamasi Washington, Telfa, Yeji, Megan Rooney, and Pedro Reyes. So we hope you can come back on many Fridays over the next 3 months. And it's really fascinating always to see how artists use the pavilion almost like a musical instrument. Kamasi Washington, will do a polyphonic sound piece here. At the same time, we will have filmmakers, we will have performances, we will have readings, we will have, philosophy. All disciplines meet here in the pavilion. We felt then with Jana Piel, our CEO, and our teams very strongly last year that it was time to add more content, and that led us to the Radical Kitchen. So it's now besides in addition to the Friday night, it's also the Thursday lunchtime. So for those of you who are busy in the evening, you can come at lunchtime, always on Thursday, and that's also going to be a very exciting moment. We are very grateful to Aesop for this partnership, and of course to our partner Nicoletta Fiorucci, with whom we program these events. The focus this year will be very strongly on food and ecology. So we will welcome Forma Fantasma, the designers, Ghetto Gastro, Yaslin Kaur, and also Zinzi Miniot. Then, of course, there is the collaboration with Mohsen and Harvard, for which we are very grateful. We always say Serpentine plus Harvard, 1 + 1 = 11. And we are delighted that this conference today will find a continuation in Wimbledon, in the Richard Rogers House, which is run by Harvard, and of course also in Boston at Harvard later this year. Mohsen and Marina need no introduction. They, of course, are all known to you. Mohsen is Dean and also the Alexander and Victoria Wiley Professor of Design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He's an architect and an educator whose work focuses on modes and processes of urbanization, and his many books include Ecological Urbanism, as well as also In the Life of Cities, Architecture is Life, which is particularly interested in the context of this pavilion, which Frida describes as a lifelike structure, which is never finished. We're going to hear from her more about that later. And then more recently also, Mohsen wrote The Ethics of the Urban, the City, and the Spaces of the Political. Marina Otero Verzier is an architect based in Rotterdam, is currently Director of Research at the Newer Institute, and also curator of Work, Body, Leisure, the Dutch pavilion at the 16th Architecture Biennale. For those of you who haven't seen it yet, it's an absolute highlight of this year's Architecture Biennale. Many extraordinary experiences happen in the pavilion. There is, among many things, also a remake of the bed-in of Yoko Ono and John Lennon with Beatrice Colomina. So, and many more reasons, of course, to go and see this amazing pavilion. Marina was also chief curator of the Oslo Architecture Triennale, was awarded recently by the Graham Foundation, who of course are also close partners of the Serpentine, and we are very grateful to them for enabling to do our architecture publication. Before now handing over to our three speakers who will actually tell us more about this pavilion, and then it will lead to a conversation, we kind of defined a rule of the game, which Mohsen suggested and which we all loved, which is this idea that we are going to interrupt each other all the time. So it will be a panel of interruptions, and in an almost Olympian sense, Georges Perec said always, the Olympian writer, we need rules of the game to kind of, write new poems and new books. And Richard Hamilton, our friend, the late Richard Hamilton, he always said we need new rules of the game for exhibitions. So Mohsen told us this afternoon we need different rules of the game for conferences to make it less boring. And so today the rule of the game will be the rule of interruptions. But before actually starting this process, I wanted to say a few thank yous. We are immensely thankful to Frida. The process to work with Frida has been amazing, and as some of you know, I read every morning 15 minutes of Édouard Glissant, because I really believe that he is the great author of our time, the Martinique writer who actually coined this notion of mondialité. And he said mondialité is a form of global dialogue which is not homogenizing, because he said, we live in an age of globalization, and this is not the first time that the world is immersed in globalization. There was globalization in the Roman Empire, there were different moments of globalization, but it's without a doubt the most extreme moment of globalization the world has ever faced, and it's a moment fueled by technology. It's a globalization process fueled by technology, and as Glissant pointed out, it leads to lots of forms of homogenizing forces, which means that a lot of things disappear. Local, languages disappear, handwriting might disappear, but also species disappear. The other day we were with A.S. Bayat, and she said, when is the last time we have all seen a centipede? And I must say, it's been years ago. And of course, Elizabeth Kolberg goes even further and says, we live in the age of the sixth extinction. It's a mass extinction. So in a way, Glissant said we need to resist these homogenizing forces of globalization. And at the same time, he says there is a counterforce coming, and we are now in the middle of that, a counter-reaction to globalization, which will even be worse, which are new forms of lack of solidarity, which are new forms of nationalism, which are new forms of racism. We can see that in many countries in Europe and, and all over the world. And he says that needs to be resisted, of course, as well. So he said we need a form of mondialité. We need every day, no matter what we do, if you're artists, if you're architects, if you're writers, in any profession, we need to think how we can contribute to mondialité. How can we empower agency of a global dialogue and enhance the global dialogue, but in a very respectful way so that it does not lead to extinction, that it does not annihilate differences. And we believe that Frida makes a great contribution with this pavilion to mondialité by bringing together so many local aspects of London and by combining it with her own memories and her own legacies of Mexico and by creating, a truly global dialogue here. But we're going to hear about that much, much more from her. I just wanted to thank her again. We are very grateful, of course, to David Ache and Richard Rogers. Jana Peel, our CEO, and I are deeply grateful to David and Richard because all year long we discuss with them, the process of this pavilion, and it's an amazing adventure and really, really wonderful. Also, David Glover plays a key role and has accompanied the scheme for so many years. I wanted to also thank Goldman Sachs for the hugely generous support of the fourth year, and it's actually the support of Goldman Sachs which enables us to make this pavilion happen, but to also keep free admission, which we believe is so important. Again, Tim Berners-Lee, this is for everyone. We thank the authors of the pavilion catalogue, Jose Esparza, John Cui, with whom we worked actually for the first time with Frida when we did the pavilion at the UMEX Foundation in Mexico in 2014. Frida did an amazing mobile design in David Chipperfield's building of the UMEX Foundation to accompany our marathon. Also, we are grateful to Marina, of course, who is going to write for the catalogue, to Till Röneberg, who is going to write about interior time, Philippe Pareno, the artist, who is going to explore further Frida's passion for Bergson. We're going to hear about that more later. Frida has a great passion for the thinker Bergson, and Philippe is going to write on that because they have that in common. Sam for Quinto, David Harvey will also write essays for this very polyphonic catalogue. Estudio Herrera have designed the publication, and we are very, very grateful to them. I'm sorry that the thank yous are so long, but this is a great, collaboratorium. So many people participate to make this pavilion possible. And of course, foremost, we are grateful also to our chairman, Mike Bloomberg. Mike always says that in the 21st century, if we want to have agency, it's very important to do it on the scale of cities. That we work actually with cities and that we connect cities to each other. That's, of course, Bloomberg's amazing, mayor initiative. And we're very happy that actually it happens this year between London and Beijing, because we just opened in Beijing the pavilion of Liu Jia-kun. And this pavilion very much has many, many ramifications and connections to Frida's pavilion. So we hope that you can see over the next 3 months our pavilion in Beijing also, which actually is very close to the Forbidden City, is adjacent to the Forbidden City. We are also very grateful to Bloomberg Philanthropies for the digital engagement platform, which makes it possible that this is even more for everyone and that the outreach is even bigger. We are deeply grateful to the Arts Council England, a key foundation for all of our work, to the Council of the Serpentine, who enabled us to do all of these projects, to the support of the Americas Foundation, the Learning Council, the patrons, the future contemporaries, and also the benefactors. And then, of course, last but not least, our own Serpentine Dream Team, without whom nothing would be possible. Julie Burnell, the tireless, amazing Julie Burnell, has already done 12 pavilions. This is her 12th pavilion as Serpentine's project director for the pavilion, a very special birthday. We are also deeply grateful to our exhibitions curator, Rebecca Lewin, who led this project from the get-go and who is here with us. Of course, also Joseph Constable, who is here today, and the Serpentine Head of Programs, Lizzie Carey-Thomas. Our thanks go also to our live programs Dream Team, Claude Agil, Lucia Pietro-Justis, Costa Stasinopoulos, Tamar Clark-Brown, as well as also Kamal Akari, who have brought this afternoon's conversation together. And now it's my great, great pleasure to hand over to Frida and ask you all to give her a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Hans. So you were mentioning this notion of mondialité, and maybe this is the way to start talking about my practice, because the way I see architecture is as a language, you know, and just like written or spoken words, I believe that it's created or constructed in different layers, and it's not just this process of accretion and accumulation, but also this process of erosion and translation. And I think it has to do with this notion of mondialité. How we keep a language constantly active is through transformation and through incompleteness, because then it can be informed. And this is one of the reasons why the practice we have in Mexico, we're 8 people right now at the office in Mexico City, is not just interested in more traditional forms of architecture, I would say, like housing projects or retail spaces or office spaces, but also this idea of research and maybe finding new ways of exploring or experimenting architecture through these smaller structures, just like this pavilion here. I think that these smaller scales projects actually have allowed us to explore some other ideas that are not possible to experiment in larger scale projects, just because the time and money that is required to produce this kind of objects is so big that it's not allowed for us as architects to really grasp these more abstract concepts. So, for example, I was thinking about the pavilion that we did in El Museo El Eco, which was one of the first experiments where we really started to explore this idea of the social time and the social way in which spaces are activated. So we just laid out this very strict pattern of cinder blocks in a courtyard in Mexico City, and in that way, with a single element, very simple cinder block, you could really reactivate the pavilion by changing the pieces. So in one way, you would have the pavilion activated by the museum with a very specific program that is laid out in a forum, let's say, or a platform. But then the people were allowed to move these pieces around. So actually, we made visible this moment where people are appropriating the space in itself. Or some other projects that have showed or materialized this more invisible or elusive behaviors was the civic stage that you also mentioned in this triennial. It was a very simple shape, this kind of circular tortilla or moon, as you were saying, that actually had a faceted surface underneath. So it was actually more like a seesaw that allowed to reconsider what the stage was. Usually what the stage is this kind of format where the speaker is on this side and then the audience is quite passive on the other side. But thanks to the commission to Jose Esparza, who is also right here with us, he challenged
Jose
us
is here, yes.
So he was challenging us to really reconsider what this condition was. And the way for us to do that was with this faceted surface. So we actually made the voice of the speaker louder physically as the audience weighed down the platform, and it actually erased. So it was more like a balancing effect, but it was about highlighting these invisible relationships or forces that shape architecture. And I think that's one of the things that we are most interested in architecture. And of course, it's an interest that appeared after I finished my master's degree at the Harvard GSD Art Design in the Public Domain program, which really shifted my idea or my understanding of what architecture is. Right now, to me, architecture not just encompasses built structures, but also the research and everything. It became a larger constellation of things. And it really materializes in a pavilion like this. So maybe I can start talking a little bit more of the strategies that we applied in the pavilion.
And before that, I think it could be great, because you mentioned Harvard and you mentioned your studies at Harvard. It would be great to hear a little bit about influences. I was kind of very interested about, so to know more about who are the architects who inspired you, who somehow encouraged you, or because you once mentioned that you saw at the very beginning of your trajectory, when before you even studied architecture, you saw an Ambas show in Mexico, and that was kind of important. But later on, I think Lina Bobardi became important for you. So it would be great to hear a little bit about the architects before we then go into the pavilion, the architects who inspired you.
Yes, well, the Ambas impression was very early on in my life. I probably was 5 or 6 when there was this exhibition in Mexico City. And I remember just being struck by these very precise forms surrounded by nature or incorporating nature into itself. So now that I think about it, it has to do with this idea of the ruin itself, like how architecture is completed or informed also by the passage of nature, the erosion, the weathering effect that it has. But it's something that I didn't realize until later on. And I think it has also to do with the roughness and the kind of brutalist approach of Lina Bobardi's architecture, if I think about it. I never made that correlation until we had this conversation here a few months ago. But maybe that's a common ground between Lina and Dambas, this idea of something that's quite open, not just in terms of the material, which ages and absorbs this passage of time, but also is an open structure for things to happen. I'm thinking about this platform that happens underneath the museum that Lina designed, and that many different programs happen without actually having any physical conditions in it. It just becomes a roofed space for things to happen. And I think being very ambiguous and open-ended actually really works in architecture, and this is something that we aim to do.
And let's talk about the pavilion here, because it's interesting that when you basically visited first and looked at the site, that you sort of came up from the very beginning with a connection that porous was, the connection to the park, but you wanted to link it somehow also to the meridians. It would be great to hear about the process.
Yes, well, it is quite a challenge to design a Serpentine Pavilion because, I mean, many wonderful iterations of the project has been made, and so many big names are associated with this. But one of the biggest challenge was to understand this dual condition that the pavilion has. Usually we know that architecture has like these very two important and intrinsic characteristics. One is the site specificity and the other one is temporality. But in the case of the pavilion, this condition completely changes because the pavilion is very site specific to the Royal Park, but just for a few months in the summer. And then it finds a more permanent home somewhere else that we don't know. So it's actually quite a contradiction to design something that has that very elusive nature. So we were trying to do something that would be attached to the gallery, to its surroundings, but also could be siteless and still have a reference to its first home or iteration. And the way to do that was to think about like more abstract concepts of time and space. We as humans are always using these more abstract ideas about time and space. You know, the Jeffersonian grid, the meridians, the way we measure time in itself. Like why 24 hours instead of 42 or 38? This is something that's very arbitrary in a way. But it happens that the Greenwich Meridian is just a few miles away from here, and that is line 0 for all our measurements of time and space right now. And this is something that is not so old. This is only in 1851 that was established as a way of measuring our distances and our time, and therefore our exchange of people, goods, our economy, our politics are defined by this very abstract line. So we thought maybe this is the way to anchor it to the space without having it to be present in the royal parks. So when the pavilion moves to a different location, it actually still becomes this compass of something that is larger, and not just in terms of physical space, but also like our cultural cosmology, no? That it will have this still have this relationship to true north and therefore to the measurement of time and space.
Mohsen, do you want to interrupt?
Yeah, maybe. Maybe. I was trying to give you a chance to complete. I think maybe for people who saw the pavilion last year, I don't know, maybe some of you saw the one last year and this year. First of all, I think I want to really congratulate you, Ulrich, and Jana, and the whole team, because, you know, in the last couple of years, I noticed that there's been a slight shift in the direction of the pavilion and the choices and the kind of interest. And in part, I think it's interesting that most of these pavilions somehow oscillate between being representational or being performative or affectual. And some of them, like the one last year, by Francis Carré are somewhere in between, because last year I remember being here, and really the reference of Francis Carré was more like the tree and sitting under the shade of a tree. And in that sense, it was representational. But because of the way that it also incorporated the rain and these other elements, it had also a performative dimension. I would say that Frida's pavilion is less representational in the sense of an image, but it's really more around focusing around the construction of a kind of environment more than anything else. It has an ambience, and in order to construct that, it relies on very specific things. And those specific things, in reference to what you were saying, and both of you around the concept of mondialité, or the reference to the way in which the making of something is to do with precise conditions. In this case, I think it's important for people to know that basically you have 3 or 4 elements, 3 or 4 materials, no more. This is not a project that's built with 15 or 20 or 30 different materials, but it's actually to do with the reduction of those materials. And I think those materials then create a certain set of qualities from the inside to the outside, to do with the change of weather and the time of day. So this idea of duration, it creates an ambience that then really utilizes those things. It's like a big sort of weathering environmental machine in some sense, because you can sense these reflections because of the ceiling and then the darkness of the walls. I think it's very interesting. But the other thing is that in reference to the discussion of sort of things being representational or effectual, you don't have an outside where you can read it like a facade of a conventional building, because you can see through it. But it's also almost opaque. So it has this sense of kind of being solid and at the same time certain degree of kind of transparency, which from the outside means that when you look to the inside, you'll see layers of space. You'll never see a single surface, which I think is an important part of the way in which the pavilion is trying to, create a certain set of conditions, but also actually having to do, ultimately, it's also a modular building, because it's made of these sort of 3 foot or whatever it is, roughly 3 foot, 1 meter by 1 meter kind of sections of the tiles. So that's also an interesting thing. How do you create this kind of very specific place, but using a sort of modular concept? So there's more to say, but I think architecturally, the idea that's very interesting is how one creates difference through the establishment of limits, by actually having very few resources, but being very creative and very imaginative in terms of the kind of diversity that you create through limitations, in a way. And I think the water, the reflection of the water, the subtlety of all these things, I think, are very beautifully done. But I think also just in terms of this year and last year and your vision, that's also very interesting to discuss more broadly, how this is a much more inclusive, in a way of thinking about architecture maybe than some of the things. There have been some fantastic things done in the past, but I think also the selection process is very exciting.
Yeah, it's very exciting also because, of course, we make a research which, on all continents with about emerging offices of architecture. So it's something which goes all year. It's certainly very polyphonic, and we also, of course, now with the second, pavilion in China, have further increased that. The idea is also that it's not a competition, but the idea is also that we now, and that's I think also a new part of this dynamic process, is that we invite, and that's something Jana and I, together with David and Richard, do every year, that we invite a very, and with David Glover, a limited number of offices, a small number of offices, to submit the proposal, and then of course creates also a dialogue, with architects over the years, and creates lots of, so it's not just this idea that every year we, commission one pavilion. It's a much more polyphonic process in a way. And but I was thinking about this, what you said about the water, and what you said also about the idea, made me think about, we're sitting here under another reflective surface, of course, of the canopy, and we are all mirrored or distorted rather, in this. It is interesting because Cedric Price once told me, the late Cedric Price, whom we unfortunately never could ask to design a pavilion, because first of all he didn't really want to build. When people ask him to build something, he would always, sidetrack this idea. But also it was somehow too late. So that's a big unrealized project. And Cedric always said that a pavilion is about distortion of space and time. And I wanted to ask Frida a little bit more about that, because I think it's interesting, the idea how you brought in the two reflective surfaces and how that also connects to time. Because these two reflective surfaces, I mean, we were yesterday in the pavilion. It was a very magical encounter in the afternoon, because there was an encounter between you and Salma Hayek, and Salma had this wonderful idea, which you can see on Instagram, on Instagram, where basically Salma thought we could, stage an image of Frida and Frida, and so you see basically Salma and Frida together enacting, the famous painting of Frida, and that, of course, in a way, is a very beautiful statement in this pavilion, the pavilion which connects so much, Mexico with the courtyard and the gelosias, to very local connections in London. It's both a Mexico pavilion and the London pavilion. So, and then we had this conversation yesterday, and we spent time in the afternoon, and the pavilion just kept changing minute by minute, and we realized what we already knew anyway, but we experienced it for the first time, is that the pavilion is never going to be twice the same. And that sort of experience of time, of an interior or internal time, is something you always wanted. You told us that that's what you wanted to achieve. And then, I always talked about glissant, and you always talked about bergson. And so I kind of thought it's kind of interesting that you maybe tell us a little bit more about that, about your interest in time, how this is a device to experience interior time, and then, of course, about your interest in bergson.
Of course. And I think it has to do with what Mohsen was saying. This is not a pavilion that could be grasping one single image. It's not about you understand it from the facade. Actually, when you see it from the facade, you just see a giant box, and it's quite boring. But when you're inside the space, some people have been asking me, is this a noble courtyard? It kind of shifts the space in so many different ways that it's really hard to understand it from one single perspective. And we were just talking about this reference also about Ed Lissitzky's and the Browns, and these drawings that are more composed about the fragments. And I think this is a pavilion that is to be understood in many different fragments. And actually it has to do with experience and memory. And that's how we also understand time. Actually, time is not linear, at least not in our perception. No? Like when you're in the dentist office, of course, time seems to go very, very slowly. And then when you remember it, it just was a snapshot. And vacations are otherwise, no? Like they happen so fast. And then when you remember, you have lots of memories, and time seems to expand again. So maybe these little fragments of space also help us to realize how this condition between something physical and something that is a little bit more interior is actually always changing. Actually, when you experience something and you remember it, it's not even the same. Therefore, if that didn't happen, we wouldn't fall in love. No, Harvard would be unbearable. We wouldn't fall in love again. So I think it's just about understanding how the perception is really changing as well as experience. Actually, memory is a ruin of experience in a way. No?
But it's probably also important to link this concept of time to that of movement.
Yes.
Because when you talk about Bergson, it's around the idea of duration. And if I am walking from here to that wall, I have a certain experience of the proximity that I arrive at through various moments. But actually, it's the duration of that movement that is part of the fulfillment of the experience of a thing in that sense. So that's also very, very interesting to kind of see the pavilion not as a series of images, even though when it's photographed, it will be like that, but as a series of here, if I move to my left, I am in this in-between space of being inside somewhere and being outside somewhere in a way. Or when I get closer to here, I see the building that's being pulled away and the experiences like that. So I think bringing it back to the body in a way seems to be an important part of what you try to achieve with time to
Yeah.
be able to kind of move through the space, no?
Yes, and actually you don't need to move physically through space, just like moving your gaze
Yes, sure.
through the space and refocusing actually changes that. When you're here and you're trying to focus, you just see like a ripple surface on the top, but then you start looking at like the faces of people on the back, and I'm able to see people on the back through the ceiling.
Mhm.
So it's reframing all the time these different conditions. Just like these tiny windows, it allows you to focus on very specific details.
And it's reframing. Yesterday afternoon, when we spent so much time again, we realized also that it's reframing the trees again and again. And the trees never looked greener in a way. It's there's an amazing thing with the trees. But I wanted to ask you one more thing about Bergson, because this morning we were with Rebecca Lewin, the curator of the pavilion, working on the book. And we were communicating with Philippe Pareno, the artist. And Philippe urged me, and urges us all to watch the Bergson. There's a Bergson lecture where one sees actually Bergson. It's a early kind of black and white thing, where you see Bergson, lecture on YouTube. And I think very fascinating, because I always try to encourage all my friends to read Edouard Glissant. And now there is Philippe Pareno, who urges me non-stop to read Bergson, and you do the same. And I think it would be interesting for all of us here to hear a little bit more why Bergson is such a toolbox for you.
Well, I think it started. It's a reference that I started using when I was actually at the GSD. It informed my thesis project. I was doing this research on this modernist building in Mexico City. It's a very simple, anonymous building. It has no famous architect who designed it. It was just like this very anonymous structure, and it had like this grid. Very specific grid, actually handcrafted as Mexican modernism is. And the facade is transparent, it's a glass surface, and actually what you see is something that hasn't changed over the years. But when you pay a lot of attention to that building, you actually see layers of history happening behind the window. So it seems like the facade hasn't changed, but everything inside has changed. And that's where my fascination with this idea of a different kind of time, a different kind of experience of time started. So this building kind of reflected this process of layering physically, but also expressing a different use of time and space. And that's why I started mentioning Bergson. And this is something that I don't read as clearly in this pavilion right now, because it's so short, that the life of the pavilion is so short, but it definitely has to do with this idea of how we experience the time within the space and how you locate yourself in the space, as opposed to seeing the architecture as an object that you can grasp totally or fully.
Yeah, so it's counter to the linear determinism,
Exactly.
which is measured by the clock in a way, And before, when Mohsen made this wonderful description and linked it also to the body, it made me think a lot of Marina's pavilion, actually, in Venice, which is about the work, the body, and leisure. And Marina, you are writing this amazing piece for the catalogue on Frida's work, and you talk there, of course, about the meridian, but you also talk about Frida's choice and use of materials as able to show us new forms of belonging beyond the national. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about your perspective on Frida's work, because I think that aspect to go beyond the national, connects to many things I sort of said in the introduction, Glissant, also the kind of connections, between cities. But I was wondering also what it is that instills this pavilion with the ability to make us question our sense of belonging, and how important it is to convey this feeling to a personal, collective, local and international level.
Yeah, I think what to me is very remarkable about the pavilion is how it is located. It's a site. It is occupying this site in a very powerful way, and yet it's also placeless. So how embodies the capacity to be grounded and at the same time be open to move and change over time, and even belong to other places that might inhabit in the next months. So also, I think that is operating in two levels. One is at the level of the tectonic and the material, in the selection of the materials that Frida did, using the celosía, this Mexican traditional idea of the wall that allows to breathe, and also the idea of the patio, but also using a material that comes from the UK. So it's always destabilizing this idea of the national, or something that you understand where it belongs. So when you think that you are in a Mexican architecture, suddenly it is not. When you think that you are in London, then you are questioning it because the pavilion is aligned with the meridian. And that's usually a very abstract construction. So when then you think you are in an interior space, you find yourself reflected next to the trees. So it's always these tensions and these plays between what you think, how do you create a site-specific project, and then how do you relate to other realities and other worlds. And that's what I think is beautiful about the pavilion, where you can belong to it, and yet you doesn't mean that you belong to a particular space that is created by very defined lines or geometries or a particular site, but it's a construction of site that is much more larger and appealing. I don't know if it's connected to what you were saying about this universalité or mondialité. Yeah.
And also in your essay, you note that more than a nod to the current discussion around sustainability, Frida's pavilion seems to be echoing her previous work on the spatial manifestations of nostalgia. How do you connect it to nostalgia?
Well, Frida has an amazing work on remittances. So how through the sending of money by migrants from the US to Mexico, and what are the architectures that are produced because of this transit of money. And there are architectures that are connected to the local environment and yet also have a reference to the culture where the migrants are inhabiting and their new, the new surroundings. So she was pointing to this idea of nostalgia and the work of Svetlana Boym, and talking about nostalgia always seems to be a longing for a place, but at the end it's also a longing for a particular time. So I was thinking that in this pavilion you can imagine again this nostalgia with these references about Mexican architecture, or also about the UK with the meridian, but also this idea you were mentioning about the movement and the passing of time. So there is a pavilion that is always changing over time and also will change location over time. So it's an impossibility of kind of grasping it entirely. So it's always embodying this type of nostalgia for time and space. Well, maybe I'm reading too much, so maybe Frida can say if she can relate to that.
No, I think you nailed it. It's a pavilion that is never going to be finished. It will never arrive, but it's just a journey, like this transit. That's important. So.
And I think you were mentioning also that you were interested in this passing of time, also how the idea of permanence is not necessarily connected to the stability of the pavilion, but rather with its ability to endure and transform over time. So we were saying maybe the plants will start growing in the tiles, or it will be a process of decay, or there will be some oxidation of the material. I don't know how will be the stage that for you will be the best or the optimum of the pavilion.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons we chose to have like these raw materials that would allow things to inform not just the pavilion. I mean, it's not just the program that informs the pavilion, but also like the climatic conditions, the weathering effect. So it's very open-ended. So it will never arrive. So I don't know, like maybe there's no perfect moment, no? Like because then it becomes static. So it's just a process of transformation.
But for people who are sort of thinking about architecture and buildings as being complete and waterproof and things like that, then hearing you talk about incompletion, ruination, all these sorts of things seem contradictory to the idea of what an architect should do. And this is, I think, one of the things that's exciting and interesting about the experiments, the kinds of things that you can do in a pavilion sometimes as a kind of, as a lab almost, of investigating some conditions, which at times might be harder to do in other kinds of buildings. At the same time, these notions are absolutely vital. So how do you talk about the notion of incompletion when you have to make a building that is complete, or the idea of ruination when the client doesn't really expect you to start by telling them about your fascination in ruins when they're investing in a lot in your project. And I think those kinds of things are very important aspects of architecture's culture to really embed it in a kind of bigger set of discussions and questions. And I think, Hans Ulrich, you will never find another pavilion that can demonstrate your interest in some of the theories that you or idea philosophies that you're interested in. I think because many of the things are really possible to explore or to demonstrate through the character of this pavilion in terms of interest in hybridity or in terms of time or in terms of destabilizing conditions of a project, I think. So it has a lot of things that I think would be hard to imagine other architects in the future doing such a good job, but that's part of the challenge of the Serpentine Pavilion for next year.
Maybe we can already take, I've got many more questions, but to make this open, maybe also if you have questions from, yeah, we've got a question here.
Thanks. The pavilion's beautiful. I just had a question in terms of the fragmentary experience, which is there also such a thing in the mondialité as, for example, a very gendered experience of the pavilion? Will people of a different sex have very different response to the pavilion? And especially in a place like Mexico, where there is still a bit of work to be done about the conditions of women being able to move freely within different spaces, how does your work as an architect sort of pour into that, if it does?
I'll try to respond to that very complex question in maybe two separate answers. I think, perception is very personal and individual, and I think it's genderless, you know, like it not necessarily has to do with gender, it has to do with more about personal experiences, but personal experiences are definitely informed by gender conditions, you know, like that how we as a society engage with each other in a very specific way because of our gender. And yes, it is a concern in my practice. We're always trying to think about, for example, in our research space work, we're considering a lot the feminine role in the domestic space, but also in the public space, because I think they're informed in complementary ways. No, so when you think about the role and the process of invisibilization of certain female figures in the domestic space, you then understand what happens in the exterior. But this is a completely different thing from the pavilion, and I don't know if your question was more about experiencing the space like through different eyes or like through different experience, and I think this is something that will naturally happen.
I think also, you know, we can go from mondialité also into other Glissantian, you know, notions, and one is of course the notion of the archipelago. You know, Glissant said the American archipelagos, and he refers of course to the archipelago around where he, you know, grew up, Martinique. The American archipelagos are extremely important because it was in these islands that the idea of creolization, that is the blend of cultures, was most brilliantly fulfilled. Continents reject mixings, whereas archipelagic thought makes it possible to say that neither each person's identity nor the collective identity are fixed and established once and for all. I can change through the exchange with the other without losing or diluting my sense of self. And it's kind of archipelagic thought, Glissant says, that teaches us this. And so, of course, when he talks about the archipelago, it made me also think yesterday when we walked around the pavilion that there are all these different spaces. We are not having here one kind of, you know, continental space. It's very much an archipelago. Is that true? Is that something you... Because there are also very intimate spaces, no?
Yes, and I think some people that come from the Latin American context immediately made an association with the celosía, no? Which is also like we borrowed from the Spanish tradition and then from the Arab tradition, so it's this layering again. But then it might be very new to some other people, so it becomes very familiar or very foreign in a way, and then it becomes familiar again. So yes, it's this process of association to personal experiences, as long as it's made in such a social relationships as well. No?
We had a question here. Yeah, first row on the right.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not an architect. I'm an artist, and I feel like I love the structure because it's such a hard material, but you have done it in such a gentle way that I feel like an avocado inside of a basket. And but I would like to understand all the. I mean, it's from the inside we get to be like the fruits and vegetables and because of the weaving. So I see a lot of femininity in it as well, in spite of the hardness of the material. But I'd like to know, or if you could kindly explain, where are the ecological and sustainability and the bioclimatic aspects to a humble human? If you could explain. Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you. Well, I think it has to do more with an understanding of the material in itself. It's used quite simply. It's an industrial material, and it's very raw. It doesn't have any finishes, and so it's not pretending to be in a very pristine condition all the time. And the fact that it's going to age, and we accept that aging, I think, has to do with an ecological understanding of something that is larger than the perfect condition of architecture. And I think this is something really important. If we understand that architecture is transforming and changing over time, and we work on more flexible structures, not just in terms of how the space is arranged, but also how the materials express a few things, then maybe we could be more gentle, to the environment. And we will accept that it informs the architecture too.
And I wanted to go from avocado to to broccoli, actually, because Edouard Glissant was once pushed against the wall, and said, because he always says there needs to be a right to opacity. He said, we need today to have a right to opacity, and he was pushed against the wall to explain what he meant by that. And he basically said, we just need to accept sometimes that we don't understand, but and then the journalist was saying, or the person who was asking the question was saying, but can you give a concrete example? And he said, I don't like broccoli, but I cannot tell you why. So he gave the kind of an example for the right to opacity. And before, during our prep meeting, we discussed opacity, and Mohsen, you said we should bring up opacity in relation to the pavilion, so I wanted to do that through the broccolis.
Okay.
Via the avocados.
Okay. No, I think the question of opacity is something that comes up in architecture because a lot of people are familiar with the discussion of transparency in contemporary architecture, and you see more and more recently that there are a lot of solid buildings that have also been appearing in the world of architecture, especially in the last 10 or 15 years. Many Swiss architects, for example, don't build very transparent buildings. They build what we might call buildings that are more, they're dealing with questions of opacity, they're dealing with thickness and solidity. And I think this pavilion is really somewhere in between in that sense. You can see through it, but sometimes depending on what angle I'm sitting here, and it's fairly opaque here, I can't really see through it. If I look that way, I can see. If I look to my left, I can see more through it. If I look to my right, from the position where I am, I can't. And so I think this idea that there are different gradations of opacity is something that is probably an interesting thing to discuss as this idea of the in-between the transparent and the opaque. And I think in terms of the Glissant reference is something that is probably very exciting, because I think partly he was also trying to say that I have the right to be opaque to some degree. I have the right to opacity. By that meaning that not all of us, like Frida is a Mexican woman, has to now be the representative of something transparent which is defined in a singular fashion, and that all of us therefore are going through this process of hybridization and are entitled to certain degrees of opacity. Therefore, I can be myself and I can be hybridized and be influenced by others and be seen to be constantly in a state of transition, of transformation, and never be, in terms of identity politics, which is obviously something we are very much in the midst of, not to be so, bracketed through, for example, certain specific identities, but having the right to a more malleable, I think, set of conditions. And I think that's what you were also probably saying about yourself, if I understood it correctly, but also in terms of what the pavilion is trying to achieve, consistent with these ideas around the exploration of the theme of gradations of opacity in some sense, which I think is very relevant today, not to just talk about modern buildings being transparent or modern buildings being opaque, but actually that we're dealing with degrees and gradations. And I think these are the things that make contemporary architecture very exciting and very interesting when you try not to fall into this trap of just being either or, a kind of contemporary modernist, or it's either this or it's either that, but actually you're exploring it. So I think that's really great and very, very interesting about the pavilion. And the fact that you can achieve it with, again, such a limited set of materials, I think it's like really, really great. Huh?
And in line of that, I was actually asking Rebecca when I was reading or going through the images of the pavilion, and I was asking, did Frida talk at all about the Barcelona pavilion, the Mies pavilion? Because these questions about opacity and transparency are very much present, this idea of reflections and how the walls that are transparent actually are opaque because of the reflections. And when I was looking into the floor plan also of the pavilion, I saw a lot of reference as well. It's, in a way, like that corner in particular, and the existence of this body of water. So I was wondering how, if you were at all thinking about this reference and how, because to me it's a very beautiful reference to a contemporary, the kind of iconic idea of the pavilion per se, that is the Barcelona pavilion, but brought in the contemporaneity with subtlety and sophistication that I would say that I haven't seen again in other works. So I don't know if that was something that was on your table or I'm reading too much.
Subconscious.
It was, it was a subconscious kind of thing. As soon as we finished the floor plan and we were looking at that corner with the water, it was like, damn, this looks a little bit familiar. But then there was like this moment of, okay, yes, but it's a translation of that. It informs definitely that corner, maybe even the proportions kind of resonate with that, but again, the space becomes a little bit more elusive because of the porous wall, because it's changing, because of the reflection, and then this pool can be drained. So at some points, the space will be activated in many different ways. So the space itself is not just elusive in its transparency, but also in the program that it can fit. Actually, this becomes a theater. And by rotating these two rectangles, you have two smaller courtyards that allow this to be a stage and to have a backstage and a front stage. So the space of activation is really modulated by these two courtyards and also the space right here with the water. So it was, yes, it was a reference, but it's also a way, it's almost like this card that you use to change its meaning. So it's like a different mask, you know, like you play it like in the theater. It's completely changing.
Now the water, you mentioned the water in relation, of course, to all of that. And there is a very interesting passage in your text, Marina, about the water. You have approached Frida's use of water in the pavilion beyond its aesthetic and also reflective surface. We spoke already about the reflective aspect of it, but you talk about it as about the water as a body that echoes the fast migrant and refugee from east to west. So I'm kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. How can architecture help us shift our focus from our bodies in space to imagine and join others that are elsewhere?
Yeah, I think the body of water has a completely different meaning by being aligned with the meridian, because the meridian was a construction, very abstract but rational idea of time and space, and obviously positioned the UK in the middle, rendering other territories always in a continuous delay and being always far away. So there was clearly positioned in a center. And when you see the idea of the meridian and the body of water is inevitable to think about how the movements and the passing of time also, and in connection to the meridian, that is what trigger also trade and circulation of goods and people and money. If you read through the contemporary eyes, it's impossible not to make a reference to the movement of people and goods and so on that are crossing the bodies of water from east to west, and in particular for certain countries to the European and UK. So I think suddenly the pavilion is aesthetically very pleasant, but is also able to bring these more socio-political questions in a very powerful way. And that to me was very striking, because I've been following the Serpentine Pavilions and I'm always fascinated by all the results. But in this case, I think the capacity to talk about very specific and local questions and yet very contemporary urgent conversations I think is quite remarkable.
Do we have more questions? Yeah, we've got a question here in the front row.
Hi, you spoke about how smaller scale projects like pavilions are a way in which practices can experiment with maybe bolder ideas or more conceptual ideas. So I was wondering, if this pavilion is the experiment, what were the outcomes or were there revelations that you want to manifest in a more enduring architecture in the future?
Well, the first result, and excellent result, is to just have this conversation, you know, like then you can really expand the spirit of the pavilion. And definitely, well, it keeps informing the practice, because these ideas of abstract notions of time and space would definitely be more present in our practice. Right now we're working on some housing projects that need to be more flexible, for example, but I think this has to do more with public spaces and how we're related in space. When you're designing for a private client, it's really easy to have a conversation that is more like writing a letter to someone. You have like this correspondence, no? You have the responses, but when you're designing a public space, you don't have a specific client. It's almost like this voiceless client that you need to resonate with. So maybe just grasping on these more general ideas can help us to merge into space in a more complex and rich way.
Do we have more questions? Yeah, we've got a question here in the middle, if you can have the mic. On the left, yeah.
Hi. I just had a question on the construction of the pavilion, and what was the greatest technical constructional challenge you had during the project? And has the limitations of the materiality changed the final product from the initial concept?
Well, there were quite a lot of challenges. We needed to make a temporary structure that would accommodate a series of programs and different groups of people gathering within the space. So we had to fit a large group of people like we have right now, but also to make it look comfortable and welcoming to a smaller group of people over, like, you know, the general life of the pavilion. So we needed to have like a very large open space like the one we have here, and you actually don't see the structure. The ceiling is quite heavy. It's a quite large ceiling, but you don't see any columns or any beams. It becomes quite light because of the reflection, but there's a big structure underneath this cladding. And actually the way these bearing walls are constructed align to the pattern of the tiles. So in this kind of weaving, like we were saying that we just had one piece, but it's also working with the metallic structure underneath. Was part of the challenge. And of course, we also had to modulate the space with some other different elements, like the water and the cafe and these two other corners that would help to help the program have this like back of house. So I don't know, it was like also having this conversation with a very large group of people that are involved in the project, and we were always in delay. We were in Mexico, and it was 0 time here, and we were always behind the schedule. So that was one of the biggest challenges.
Are there more questions? Yeah, we've got a question here at the back on the left-hand side.
Hello. Well, first, thank you and congratulations. I would like to ask about how you use the celosia again, and whether or not it was blatantly an attempt of bringing an element that is Mexican into your work, or if it was unconscious. Going back to the question of architecture as a tool for search of an identity, whether or not it is cultural.
I think we tried to use the celosia in a different way. If you think about Hyde Park, and you see the city of London, and actually in every park, in every big city, you feel like you're outside the city, but you're actually within it. And when you design a pavilion, especially an enclosed one, you design a courtyard, then you're outside the garden, but inside the pavilion. So it becomes almost like this Russian doll of exteriority and interiority. So when you have a very porous surface that allows the landscape to filter in a very specific site, but then it becomes solid, as Mohsen was saying, when you see it in a diagonal way, it becomes like this. It's dual.
Sure.
It's open, but it's closed. It's interior, but it's exterior. So we were trying to play with that contradiction. That was the reason why we used the celosia. And of course, it's something that we knew about because we have it in Mexico City, and this is something that we live with in every day. So we tried to incorporate that. But it was more about framing the landscape and allowing it to come in, and also having 4 walls that define this space.
And take maybe one more question, if there is. I've got a question here in the front row, if you can have the mic. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Dara. I'm the founder of DH Liberty, and congratulations. Thank you for choosing a young woman. It's amazing. So I have 2 questions. One is there anything that was built that you didn't expect that surprised you in a good way? An example for me is when I saw the photos, the rivets in the ceiling make swirls, and that wasn't in the renderings, and I loved that. I thought that was really cool, and it was a way to show you an abstraction. You can kind of see it more from further away. And also, what's your favorite pavilion and why? Because everyone has a favorite Serpentine Pavilion, and they have a reason. And yours is now in the collection of Serpentine Pavilions, and it's a very simple question, but I think it tells a lot about somebody.
Actually, there's an app now where you can choose what pavilion you are. It's really interesting. It's very fun. It's not the one that I am. It's not my favorite, I have to say. I won't tell you which. But it's a fun game. I'm wondering if next year we will have the same, like, are you a Frida Escobedo pavilion? And what questions would that be? But yes, you're right. And also the rivets were a big surprise. I mean, with reflective materials, this is something that we didn't expect or we couldn't plan. And yes, I think it was a good surprise because it echoes the pattern that is created by the water. So instead of having like this cleaner effect, you have like just this ripple that really distorts the space. And to pick a pavilion, that's a very tough one. I'm on the spotlight here. But yes, I would say, of course, and it has a relationship to what we did here. Of course, the Peter Zumthor Pavilion, and also Ai Weiwei and Herzog at the Miron, I think, are one of my favorites. Just to say 2, I mean, but there are so many great.
Yeah, it's interesting because actually several people mentioned yesterday even if there's no resemblance whatsoever, because of course Zumthor created a hortus conclusus, so it wasn't porous at all. It was a very hermetic, almost cloister-like situation. But I think this idea just of the enclosure, very few pavilions have actually created an enclosure, which is I think why there was this resonance. And I was kind of wondering, to conclude, I had a question for all the 3 of you about the city, because I think it's kind of interesting that we go from the pavilion, because of course he's also in a park, but we're also in the middle of a very big city. And I kind of think, in a way, this is a truly democratic space. It's a space for everyone. And there is, as Vito Acconci, in one of our last conversations, Vito said, there is not enough public space. Because no matter where you go in a big city, you're kind of obliged to consume, or you're kind of obliged. There's always, there are very few spaces where I can just, which are not prescriptive. And this is a deeply non-prescriptive space. Basically, everybody can find out the way they want to use this pavilion, and it starts in the morning when the earliest visitors are often the joggers, like at 6 a.m. and the joggers every year find their own use, of the pavilion. And then throughout the day, you have people who make meetings here, and they spend hours and hours here meeting their friends and having gatherings. And people can just stay here as long as they want. It's a truly open space. And also there are no doors. I think it's very relevant, the idea that there are no doors. I mean, the other day, last year, I came back from a trip, and a taxi driver dropped me very early one morning, like at 6:30 a.m. in Kensington Gardens. And obviously, he assumed I would work here because it was out of opening hours. So he said, are you working at the Serpentine? I always wanted to talk to someone who works at the Serpentine. So I said, yes, I am working here. And he said he wanted to tell me the story of his daughter, because they came to the pavilion last summer, and all of a sudden his daughter ran into the pavilion because there are no doors. You need to run in. And he said, and that's very strange because I never go to museums. We never go to museums. I said, why? And he said, because I don't think it's for people like me, which I thought it was, extremely fascinating that there are these, barriers, visible and invisible barriers, which we need to remove because we want everyone to have access. And now comes the end of the story. The reason he wanted to tell me this story is that he says, his daughter had an epiphany, and ever since she experienced this pavilion, she's only reading architecture books and really has found her way and wants to study architecture. And he wanted to thank us. So in a way, this epiphany was for her maybe a little bit what happened to you with, when you were 6 years old, seeing this Ambas situation, or what Katsuo Sejima once told us when she sat in her pavilion here and told us that, she was like a 10, 11-year-old child in Japan, and all of a sudden, through her parents, she discovered metabolist architecture. I think it was Kikotake's house. Kikotake's house, and that suddenly just triggered everything, and I think this idea of having such totally open spaces in cities, public spaces, is very important. And I was kind of wondering to hear from the three of you your view on that and how we can create more of that in cities, because we obviously need more of that.
Were you looking at me? No, I think that the Serpentine Pavilion has done something to transform the park, because the way these parks were originally imagined and the kind of lives that they sort of enabled have been radically transformed through the introduction of the Serpentine Pavilion. So I think that's sort of an interesting thing to reflect on. But I think in terms of public spaces, London is it's very unusual in relation to many other places to have so much open space and to have so much public space for the citizens. And I think that that probably is sort of an exciting aspect of the kind of the openness or the deliberative dimension of the city, because I think going back to this discussion of different communities existing in cities, often I feel that the communities are also limited to their own neighborhoods or to their own localities. So in London, it seems parks actually do offer a kind of counterpoint to the notion of the neighborhood or to the notion of the local, by being a much more open or democratic space in some ways. And they all have their own sort of character. But I think part of the challenge now is when we're designing cities, how do we conceive of new forms of public space? Because new cities can't generally kind of produce this type of park. So the conception of sort of public space and how that's changing, that I think is a kind of interesting one to discuss in terms of the planning of cities and how urbanization enables new forms of participation or new forms of juxtaposition and things like this. I mean, in terms of my own work, one thing that I've been interested in recently is that some of the issues around this idea of worldliness, of being, understanding kind of the impact of the other and influences, that those things also have their own limits, in the sense that in cities we also need to think about the moment where we will also accommodate spaces where we are not all going to be agreeing with each other and going to have spaces of disagreement. So I've been kind of this publication, this book that you mentioned around ethics of the urban, part of it for me is around the discussion of what I call agonistic urbanism, which is actually the idea that cities are not always this kind of melting pot of happy people agreeing and diversity and hybridity, but diversity and hybridity will also have its own limits at some point, and we have to acknowledge that we will need to think about the design of our cities, which is more acknowledging, the concept of agonism or agonistic urbanism, in the sense of like, what are the limits of agreement and how do you enable an architecture which actually allows for disagreement, which is different than like fighting with each other. It's not antagonistic, but it's actually agonistic. So that I think some of the issues that are embedded in the pavilion touch on this question of the nature of relations, the nature of relationships, the limits of agreement, and how do you think about the sort of the city and how important it is that it has the capacity for sort of disagreement. Because when we, for example, think about suburbs, it's hard to think about them accommodating the kind of diversity because of the homogeneity that they promote. So I think those are some of the issues that are facing the discussion of urbanization or the discussion of cities today. And it's very hard to really find fantastic ways of addressing them. But I think that's the challenge and that's the excitement, how urbanization can be, accommodating concepts such as agonism or things like that. So,
Marina, do you believe in agonism?
Oh, yes, I believe in agonism. But what I was thinking is that the concept of public space is so much under pressure because it's subjected to economic, commercial forces continuously. So we cannot take it for granted somehow what it is public. And when you think about creating a public space, you need also to think about what type of rituals are being created and around which people can meet and gather, either to disagree or to agree or to just be in the same space without even looking at each other. So I think in general, the pavilion, like the Serpentine Pavilion, creates that ritual. So every summer, there's going to be this space where you can have a coffee and you can even experience architecture without being, as Benjamin will say, in a state of distraction. So people will come here and they will never know that there is a brilliant architect, Frida Escobedo, who has designed the space. They must just enjoy the space without knowing more about contemporary architecture, and I think that's brilliant. And in this particular case, I think it's very welcoming, and I think what we need is very welcoming spaces, and that has to be also not only by having many different entrances, allowing for places for gathering, but also in terms of aesthetics. I think this is a very precise, beautiful, and has a very strong aesthetic, but at the same time is one that is not imposing, and is not really creating not trying to be too pretentious, is not trying to be too shiny. It's something that, at least, I don't know if you agree, but makes you feel comfortable in it. And that's very weird and very rare to find, a place that is you feel at ease and is welcoming. So that's, to me, what public space needs.
And Frida, maybe some final words by you on public space, on the future of the city. Do you believe in agonistic? It's not
Why do you say it so quietly?
Do you believe in agonistic, urbanism? And also, I think it's interesting because one thing we didn't touch upon really in the conversation, and I think at the very end now, it could be great to hear you speak about this, is of course your engagement with cities also through social housing, because you have in Mexico very major social housing projects underway, and it would be good to hear about that in relation to what Mohsen and Marina just said.
Yes. Well, I am a believer, and I think it has to do with also providing spaces for contemplation, for individuals to find a little corner where to kiss, or where to hide, or for children to be playing, but also places of encounter. And this is one of the reasons why the reflector roof is also like a tool for that. You can see yourself in it, you can take a selfie, but you are able to see others without looking at them directly. And this kind of more voyeuristic, filtered observation might also be some kind of useful tool to recognize differences, and to observe yourself within the space. So it's, I think that the mirror helps in that way. Like it becomes like this kind of less invasive way of recognizing the other within the same space. And regarding the social housing projects, and it has to do with the client and how we define this more ruination or ruinous process. And we're always trying to use new words to substitute the ruin or the decaying or the changing. And we're trying to use words more like flexible or malleable or fluid. And this is something that it has to do a lot with the social housing process projects that we develop at the office. We are always trying to do structures that would do more with less, very much like this pavilion, like using very simple materials, trying to reduce the cost of the construction, so we can also reduce the debt of people who acquire the houses, but also creating structures that not only will grow in the future, but might also recede in the future, because we're always thinking that families are like very, like encased in one single thing, and it's not. Like families are flexible, families are changing, and sometimes they contract and expand. So it's about understanding that the type of fluidity that also informs the projects that we do.
And if you want to know more about this fluidity, you all have a copy of the special issue of Aesop's literary publication, The Fabulist, where you can find an amazing conversation between Frida Escobedo and the writer Alejandro Zambra, as well as other pieces of writing which have to do with the Serpentine summer program. We hope you can come back many times on Fridays and Thursdays and any other day. And I would like to thank Frida, to thank Marina, to thank Mohsen for this wonderful conversation. Thank you all for being here. Thanks a lot.